The Yu-Gi-Oh! Ban list has finally settled in, and the meta has been shaken up. Even if the changes weren't as drastic as maybe we hoped for, there still is a noticeable difference in the game between now and a couple weeks ago. But as it is still fairly early on in the format and we're only just realizing the level of change that has happened, I'm going to go over what I perceive to be the biggest winners and losers of the ban list. If you enjoy these types of discussion videos, make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below on what type of topics you want to see me go over next. Whether you want it to be hyper meta related like this one is and focusing on changes to the ban list, or there's something else in specific you want to see. Also, if there's any opinions you think I missed or things you don't agree with, feel free to let me know down below, because constructive criticism is good for everybody. There is a very real chance that I missed something that is super important. But alright, let's get into it. Okay, so if I had to pinpoint one biggest winner in all of this exchange, I'd have to say it's Yugioh. This deck didn't go entirely unscathed, with Spirit Gates going to one that is somewhat of a small hit to the deck. But at the same time, the deck also didn't lose any of its core pieces. A lot of the consistency still remains there, its combo potential remains intact, and even though Beatrice and Lacrim are banned, the existence of Aerial Eater drastically improves the dynamic of Fiend Smith cards in any actual Fiend deck, like Yugioh or Unchained. And it means almost that you don't really care too much that those cards got hit. In fact, alleviating space in the extra deck isn't even that big of a deal. Even if the combos are slightly worse or a little more inflexible, you do have other worthwhile cards you can put in its place, where in other decks there wouldn't really be any substitutes. The deck's end board is also just ridiculous, being more flexible than kind of other decks right now, and not being standardized at the moment. It can do things such as ending on Rage into SP, the Escape of the Unchained Trap card, as well as Phantom of Yubel, obviously a crazy card, with Vaudeo, the Baron Retrain, which is just crazy that this card is still around, I guess, for now, as well as DDD Wave King High Caesar, another fantastic, crazy, powerful card. Or you could end on Desiree, another Omni Negate. And it's not like you're ending on one of these, you're ending on several. Even though you may not end on literally all of those things every game, you can pretty much count on at least Rage being there, as well as Phantom Yubel, and then maybe Desiree or Caesar or Vaudeo, or pick 2 out of the 3. But that's quite an elaborate field to break through, and the deck's grind game is still very good. Even if you aren't pseudo-FTKing the same way that maybe Snake Eye could, you still do have very, very layered interruptions that's very hard to beat through, and if you board break through it, there's good follow-up to kind of get through that. Now, as opposed to Snake Eye, this deck is a little more vulnerable to specifically Dark Luna more, but then again, it's not like it's impossible. For one, Desiree paired with a chainable trap card does beat it, and it's also important to note that with Appaloosa being gone, this deck does actually have a way to beat Nibiru, where a lot of other decks don't. So this deck doesn't really have a hard time preventing Nibiru from wiping the floor. In fact, you could argue that Nibiru is just straight up not a good card against this deck. And you could argue that, okay, well, you want to use Veil or Nibiru to kind of outplay your opponents, but this deck could just play around even further and start making double Phantom. It's kind of crazy. This deck can push through hand traps incredibly well when it goes first. Now, with Spirit Gates gone and losing a bit of the extension, it is a bit worse when it plays going second. But if every deck's end field has also gotten weaker, and the biggest problem for this deck going into board is Appaloosa is also just gone, then your engine can actually push through a significantly amount of more than it could have in the past. And this deck, although had less non-engine than Snake Eye, it still can fit in a rather healthy amount. Or you could even just lean more into the engine aspect and play a larger package of Yubel cards, because that's not even that bad. These cards are very strong, including cards like Mature Chronicle, which really don't see play in the most modern versions of this deck. I think this deck is shaping up to be one of the most powerful decks of the format. It was very similar to Snake Eye in the last format. And with Snake Eye being hit, Snake Eye is not dead by any means. Yubel, which was only a bit weaker before, kind of is going to rise up to the challenge to replace it. I think the biggest thing that's also getting overlooked here is this deck didn't really care about Lacrim that much, with Aerial Eater being such a dynamic card in actual Fiend strategies. As we start to see the format develop, I wouldn't be surprised if Yubel takes on the shape that Snake Eye had last format, and Snake Eye kind of shifts where Yubel was, both being heavily present decks in the format, but Yubel being a little bit more of the driver and taking up more spaces in Top Cut. The other big winner here for decks is kind of a broad one, and that is high engine count decks, and this is largely pertaining to 60 card decks that can use Grass. Now, I might be the only person who really thinks Grass is that powerful of a card, but I've seen it do wonders in Master Duel. Cards like Triple Tactic Thrust and Left Arm Offering people to search Grass mean that it being a 1-of really isn't the end of the world. I mean, this is a deck archetype that really didn't exist before the ban list, so obviously it's going to be a winner here. But even more so, again, compounding on that Appaloosa ban means that decks that have a lot of monster effects and graveyard effects really have more of a time to shine than they have had in a really long time. It doesn't just pertain to Yugioh, because Yugioh I think can also be played in a 60-card manner with Grass, more Grave Squirmers, and some other graveyard effects. Or even like a Fiend Pile with Shyama in there. But you could play Tyr, you could play Lightsworn, you could play Infernoid Snake Eyes. You can really be flexible with where you want to go with these high-engine decks. And now that people's end boards realistically should be somewhat weaker, barring Yugioh being the exception, you can push through stuff. And even when you play versus a deck that is powerful like Yugioh, if they're not ending on too many spell and trap negates, then Grass should just punch them. But say you have a way to push the Grass through an Omni Negate like Vaudeo, then you just get through there anyways. I think these decks are in a lot better position than they really have been in quite some time. They tend to do well versus hand traps like Ash, Imperm Veiler, because they have way more gas than one kind of negate can hold back. The thing that's really stopped it is the cards that are extremely high value negates, like Appaloosa, because it is 3 negates in 1, or 4 negates, sometimes 2. But that was the largest thing holding it back. And now that we have more spells to help, support that, as well as some of the bigger problem cards no longer being a threat to you, it does mean that decks like this are actually looking kind of nice in the future. Now, as for which variant is going to thrive the most, I think that remains to be seen. And we're going to kind of have to see on which format, which engine lines up the best into, which can play the most non-engine while still being consistent, and which can make the best end fields. Now, I think intuitively, I'd almost want to explore Yugioh first, because I think in Master Duel and in OCG, you couldn't play Yugioh at a higher deck count than 40, because if you got maxied, you were kind of just game overed. But in TCG, I think you can load in some more graveyard effects to make mills better, and then play Thrust Left Arm Grass, and then just Grass. Because even if you don't mill graveyard effects, milling like Yugioh cards to make Phantom, it's really good. Like, it's not to be understated how powerful that is. And of course, on top of that, you still have access to all the crazy end board cards, and then you can throw in a whole bunch of other powerful non-engine, whether it be like Dark Ruler, Talons, Metal Tronus, Ash Blossom still. Maybe you want Cross Out to protect your Thrust or Grass from being ashed. I will probably have a bunch of videos on the channel over the next few weeks trying out new Grass decks, because at least from my perspective, that's what I'm most excited to retry in Yu-Gi-Oh! So if that's what you want to see as well, then let me know. If there's any in specific, whether it be Infernoids or Lightsworn or Tyr, that you want to see me prioritize getting out to you first, and now is the time to do so. Comment down below, and I'm happy with any of them, so whichever you guys decide is what you want to see, then, I'll do it. But that's all there is for decks that I felt like are winners. I didn't think there was too much that felt like a winner from this ban list. I didn't really foresee things turning out exactly the way it did, and we'll get to that as I proceed. But there were a couple cards that I felt like got significantly better through this list, and I wanted to talk about those before I moved on to other topics. The first of which is the most obvious one, and that is Nibiru, the Primal Being. This card is going to take on a lot bigger of a part on the metagame than before, now that Appaloosa is gone. There are still ways to beat this, and obviously being an engine Phantom of Yugioh still does, but a lot of other decks are going to have to resort to other methods, specifically like DD, Wave King, High Caesar. But for the most part, it is a lot harder to prevent Nibiru from being a devastating force now. And in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, it's not really reasonable for a deck to just not play into Nibiru. Some decks can kind of try force past it, which Snake Eye can still try and do right now, albeit it'll be worse. But most decks can really just go, I'll summon less than 5 times. Really, only decks that'll do that are stun decks and like Labyrinth. So it's not like Nibiru is a card that'll fluctuate in and out of the format like Maxi used to 10 or so odd years ago. The game is fast enough now that I think Nibiru is like kind of where Maxi was when it was approaching unhealthy. Not that I think Nibiru is unhealthy. I don't think Nibiru can ever approach the same level of toxicity that Maxi was. I think Nibiru is the balanced version of it, but we're at the point where summoning 5 times is so like necessary in a turn of Yu-Gi-Oh that Nibiru seems really good right now. Now, that doesn't mean there's no counterplay to it. Again, I mentioned DD, Wave King, High Caesar. If you aren't following how to summon that, because it requires 2 Fiends, what you're going to have to do is turn 2 monsters into your Closed Sky, Closed Sky into Requiem, into Engraver, equip the Requiem, turn those into Necroquip Princess, and then use Engraver's effect, shuffling back one of your life Fiends to summon itself back, and voila, 2 6s into Caesar. Now, obviously, they can get Nibiru here, but if you have any way to extend past this, then you are all set. Now, obviously, this does stop other hand traps, and now specifically, like in the case of Snake Eyes, even if you insulate yourself from, say, Nibiru, you've used a fair bit of your engine to get to that point. Now, the next piece of your engine may be your last extender. If you get Ash Blossom there, Appo can't protect you from that anymore. So I do think it is still definitely a downgrade, but it's not to get too excited about. Like, see, as good as Caesar is, it's no Appaloosa. Now, kind of continuing along this topic, with Nibiru being a card that I feel like got exponentially better, a card that's getting exponentially better is the card I just mentioned, and that's Caesar. So I guess I did already talk about this, but yeah, I think this card is extremely important right now. And even if you're playing a deck that doesn't play Fiends, if you have one Engraver even, because this is something that you can play with one Engraver, you can turn into monsters into Caesar. And the thing is, like, even if you do get stopped on your backup engine, like say you get Ashed on original and you don't get to proceed your combo, ending on Caesar is still very fine. Like, it's arguable this card is better than Appaloosa because it's a lot harder to just attack over it, and the 2 negates is pretty impactful. So like, if this card becomes a staple in metagame, something that Snake Eye duels can do, for example, is play Sinful Spoils of Subversion, because that'll mean they can go Witch, and then they can go set this, Subversion, push it back, and that effectively removes it while really giving up almost nothing. They still have the Witch Body, they can then link off into their own Fiends with combos and kind of push forward. The weird thing about Caesar being a card, and a card you want to make very often, is if you're doing this, is sometimes when you can't get to Sequence and then to Desiree. So oftentimes you're going to have to choose between these 2 cards. And while that makes Caesar stocks go up a lot, it means Desiree stocks actually go down quite a bit, which is rather interesting. Now, something else you can do when you have any 2 bodies that's a generic end piece interruption, similar to Appaloosa, but not Fiends with cards, is Silhouette Rabbit. A card we've already talked about on this channel a few times before, but I think is very good and only more well positioned now than it has been in the past. Now, if you aren't familiar, it's a generic link 2 that lets you set a continuous trap from the deck that can special summon itself. Particularly, what I want to summon is Angel Statue as a rune, which is like a Thunder King Ryo and negates any special summon. Now, it does have to be a inherent summon, so not something like Monster Reborn, but you can negate Link summons or Diabolical the Blackwood, something that doesn't start a chain. It also has the ability that when destroyed by battle, you can destroy the monster that attacked it. So even if they're able to get a high attack monster in the field before you flip it up, it's not completely easy to play around. Now, on top of that, Silhouette Rabbit is an illusion, meaning it cannot be destroyed by battle. This can come up against decks like Tempai or whenever you're needing to protect yourself from being OTK'd, so that way your follow-up can, actually be used instead of just dying on the spot. Now, it also has one other effect, and that is when you summon a monster with Spell Trap card zone, you can target a Spell Trap card your opponent controls and destroy it. This card is fantastic because there's going to be different types of interruptions. This will let you push through your opponent's spells and traps, or to destroy spells and traps like field spells, like saying in Summoning, or Nightmare Throne, or Opening Spirit Gates, which can all be good ways to pressure, as well as set up the negate with the statue itself. Now, it's nowhere near as powerful as Appaloosa, but it also requires less material. The card is undoubtedly very strong. In fact, it was in my Nationals deck, it was in the NAWQ first place deck list. It's good then, and with more extra space now than before, I'd argue you can easily slot this in as a sort of replacement. Now, it doesn't fill in the exact same role that Appaloosa does. In some decks it might, but in a lot of decks that were trying to play around hand chest by establishing Appaloosa early, this card's going to come nowhere near to fulfilling the same role. So while this card is fantastic and a lot better now than it was before, this is not Appaloosa 2. But yeah, very good card. And that's kind of really all I felt like really came out as winners in this ban list, because not much really got unrestricted. And the stuff that did get its limits released a bit kind of just sucked. Like, I'm not going to ever tell you Dragon Rulers are the winners here because you're not playing Dragon Rulers. You don't. So yeah, I think there reasonably aren't actually that many winners in the list, and we're looking at a relatively similar format to before, with maybe roles shifted a little bit and decks a little bit weaker overall, but mostly just the same thing. Another big winner are board breakers. Now, this is another broad spectrum of cards, but what I'm looking at here is with Beatrice being banned, decks can no longer as easily at least search lingering floodgates that would sort of invalidate breakers. Take Dark Ruler, for example. Now, a reason I wouldn't have felt comfortable bringing Dark Ruler to a tournament is it's very easy for someone to say, all right, I'm expecting board breakers, and then I'll go Beatrice, detach Lacrima, send Angel Blue Tears to the grave, and then set DDG, or Dimensional Barrier, depending on the deck. And I mean, it came in several different forms as well, right? Beatrice Griffin, Beatrice for Flagon Protoss. So while lingering floodgates may still exist in the format, and I should expect to see them to some degree still, right now they seem to be a lot less accessible, meaning breakers have a lot more place in the format. Now, Yubel seems to be pretty good versus breakers. I wouldn't be too inclined to rush towards breakers yet, or say they're like the absolute best thing in the format now that hand traps suck, but I do think there's a chance that breakers has improved significantly from where they have in the past. And as we kind of see the metagame evolve, I think it'll equalize a little bit more upon the ratio of what we see breakers versus hand traps. But no, I think there are some other interesting things to look over that aren't just losers. There's two neutral almost positions I want to look at where the changes are kind of interesting to look at, but they did get hit in a way that is not really good for them, but also not end the world for them. Now, the obvious one there is Snake Eyes. this deck was not hit as hard as I would have liked. I would have liked to have seen it being blasted into the stratosphere, being no longer playable at all. The core strategies are very much intact, with Flamebird still existing, giving you access to several different bodies to link with, and also being able to do the shenanigans of throwing stuff in the spell trap card zone, bringing it up on your opponent's turn as a way of like avoiding board breakers. Promethean Princess is still one of the best cards ever printed, and being a fire deck, you have full access to that. The Snake Eye cards are still just very good at playing with very few resources to make some really powerful plays. But while all that is true, there are still very reasonable hits to the deck. I'm not even talking too much about Ash and Popular to 1, because those matter, I guess, not as much, but Lacrima and Beatrice being banned is somewhat important, because although Fiendsmith cards are still usable in this deck, and I probably still would play them, if you don't draw Snake Eye cards alongside your Fiendsmith cards, the Fiendsmith cards themselves don't actually access your engine anymore. Before, you could get Beatrice and play via that into Princess, but now without Lacrima or Beatrice, you really don't have any of that sort of capability. It's also important to note that without Lacrima, you don't have a way to generate a ton of bodies using the Fiendsmith engine. You can make Desiree, but that alone isn't going to be the most effective way of linking up your bodies into like Princess to really get the most value out of the Fiendsmith cards. It is a very noticeable step down. And it's not like Aerial Eater is as well suited in something like Snake Eye as it is in the Yubel deck. You could make Aerial Leader and then send Engraver to the grave, and have like a little bit more flexibility than Desiree, but compared to Lacrima, it is a far cry from the amount of link materials you were being given. The problem that I'm trying to solve with the Snake Eye deck is if you get like Impermed or whatever on your Witch, which is going to be your main way of kind of accessing your Snake Eye engine now, outside of your 1 Ash, 1 Poplar, and 1 Bonfire, then how do you get forward with this deck? Because most of the traditional ways of extending required Beatrice as your kind of catalyst to keep it all going together, and kind of just can't do that anymore. I think cards like Ash Blossom will be a lot more crippling for this deck, but when you don't get Ash Blossom, the deck is still just very fine, and there are going to be a fair number of hands where you can just play through Ash Blossom because you drew Bonfire, or you drew Snake Eye Ash, or you drew Poplar, or you drew Crossout, or you drew Callby. Yeah, it's not that crazy. If you're curious some ideas to have in mind, I do want to make a bit of a video on my Patreon, where if you haven't heard about it already, is a place to get some exclusive content from me as well as support me. You can also sign up for my coaching classrooms there ahead of events. But I think over the next few days, I'm going to be posting another video there about how to adapt decks in the face of a ban list where you need to address new concerns, and Snake Eye is going to be the primary example there. Some of the ideas I have to kind of innovate Snake Eye in a new fashion that fixes the kind of issue that I just mentioned. But yeah, Snake Eye is still very functional, but the list did hit it in a tangible manner. I think this deck is still fantastic, although I don't know if I'd say it's the best deck anymore. But yeah, I'll probably reckon that Yubel is now better positioned than Snake Eye is. That doesn't mean Snake Eye is bad though, so don't expect it to go too far. And the next deck I want to look at is Tempai. It's a unique case. Its viability is largely dependent on its surroundings. It's consistent, doesn't have that many bricks, and it's rather hard to interact with negation being not that good against it, and removal being kind of finicky. You can also play a rather large suite of non-engine that you can adjust based on the format. How well it does largely depends on what your opponent's doing. If they're going to have cards that interact well with the Tempai, if they have very strong endfields you can't really prevent or can't beat, or both, because those are all going to make factors in Tempai's viability as it chooses second. It's almost easy to say that when more cards are released and the card pool and power level of the game goes up each new set, Tempai, if all things held constant, doesn't change its own card pool, will get worse, because things will only get better. And then by that counter argument, when the game gets weaker as a result of Banlist, for example, then Tempai should improve in its positioning. Now, obviously, the degree to what it changes is in itself variable, but I think you can kind of see that happening where if we get into a weaker format, Tempai can prop itself up a lot better. Now, that being said, this format, there wasn't a hit to Tempai. Tempai was not unscathed. Saying it's something to 1 does make a difference. You are going from 4 copies to 2 copies, meaning there are a lot of games where you want to start off with Padra in order to access your Sanguine Summoning, and you can be Veiled or Impermanent there now, which before it would not have been a meaningful target. Now, the limiting of the card only really affects the consistency. I don't think the 2nd and 3rd copy really matters too much for a grind game, exception being one case. And this is actually a case where I still a Hat Rabbit might be a bit better. Now, if you remember my Nationals deck, I talked about one thing that I wanted to do if I got shifted by Tempai to make Silo Hat Rabbit. Even though Azur's statue cannot send itself to grave to negate a synchro summon under Shifter, it does give you ways to protect yourself from battle, and Still Hat Rabbit itself cannot be destroyed by battle. And then on top of that, when you summon the Azur's statue, you'd pop a back row, so you'd wait for your opponent to play the Sanguine Summoning, then pop it. Now, in order for them to kill you through the statue and the Rabbit, what they often had to do was to go Trident Dragon, blow up their field spell, and go up to 9,000. So what that meant is I'd pop the first field spell with the Rabbit, and then they need a second one in order to kill me. So while that was possible before, now that's actually just not even the case. They're going to have to bait out these interruptions before committing to this. Otherwise, they will kind of lack a way to effectively push through my field. Because keep in mind, while Shifter is good in Tempai, it does lower their ceiling, meaning they are overall more vulnerable to interruption. Outside of that, though, the hit does serve mostly as a consistency hit. So you can't just lead with Sangan Summoning and be almost immune to almost anything that goes on. But Tempai is still just fine. Being able to play this large on engine and be consistent and not have bricks your deck is a fantastic thing. So while I think this deck is not the best in a major competitive setting because of its predictability and being something that punishes mostly players that play incorrectly against it, I do think it's still in a fine position overall, and even more so in lower leveled events. And alright, let's move on to the biggest losers of this ban list. Let's start off with the obvious one, Fiendsmith cards. So yeah, this one suffered drastic hits. Lacrima is not something that I expected to get banned. Honestly, I didn't even consider it as a possibility. I thought if they were going to hit a new card, it would have been Closed Sky. And this is a good hit. It's not like it did nothing to the deck. You lose a lot of the flexibility that you got from the Fiendsmith cards, now being forced to make Desiree or Aerial Leader in most cases. And even then, in some cases, it's not possible to make Desiree, because you have to shuffle back a Light Fiend to extend with the Engraver. Now, it is important to note that, as I already mentioned, the Rank 6 access isn't cut off because of Lacrima's ban. Both Aerial Leader and Necroquip make sure that this is still functional. It's almost like weird that Konami decided to print those cards, because I think this would have been a lot more meaningful of a hit if those cards didn't exist to prop Fiendsmith back up in a strong position. But even in those cases, say for like the Necroquip, for example, you may not get access to the Link 2 alongside the Rank 6 that you would have had in the case of a Lacrima variant. Now, the engine is far from useless, and I still expect Fiendsmith cards to play a big part in the upcoming format, whether it be a single Engraver as a way to make Caesar in a lot of different combat decks, or the traditional Fiendsmith package, because it still provides a solid ability to generate Link fodder, negates Rank 6s, or push through fields, even if it is diminished from before. The engine is definitely no longer as proficient at extending through fields as going through grind games or developing Link foddies, but it still does all of those things, albeit just a bit worse. So Fiendsmith definitely are a loser here. There isn't an upside in this equation, but it's not like the deck or engine is far from dead, and I'm still looking forward to exploring it in several different strategies. Now, next up is Burning Abyss. Yeah. Collateral damage, if you will. And I talked about this before, how I love Burning Abyss, and I'm sad to see it go, but Beatrice had outstayed its welcome. So as we send our farewell to Beatrice, Burning Abyss is now going to suffer without its main win condition. I don't know if you'd call Beatrice the most important card of the deck, because Dante, Seer Graph are all arguably more important, but it's still an important part of the deck's functionality, and the deck already wasn't that good. I don't know how you'd really adapt this, but that's going to be a challenge of my own. I think I'm going to make a video on this, so if you guys want to see me pump out a BA video in the future, then let me know, because as a huge BA fan and being 10 years old now, I want to honor Burning Abyss and find a new way to play this deck. Even though it's not tier 1 meta, it's still functional and a good way of using the engine in a way that's unique. But on the topic of Beatrice, we also have another thing to talk about. A lot of rogue decks will randomly hit pretty bad with Beatrice being banned. Now, Beatrice is toxic. It enables so many different things that have no right in the game that, again, its ban was well earned. With that being said, this deck was a key part in a very fair way to a lot of different decks. Let's look at my Mimigul deck, for example, the deck that I showed on the channel. And what I was looking for in that deck was a way to trigger my Mimigul cards I gave to my opponents without playing a lot of shitty cards that are unsearchable, like Book of Tayu or Swords of Revealing Lights. They're just bad cards. And what AD Changer plus Beatrice let me do was play one singular card that if I drew was fine, but otherwise didn't have to. And they could turn any of my bodies into the Fiendsmith package, then get Beatrice and turn on all my abilities. Because once I flip up their monster, I can use Unicorn, I can use Talent, I can use Thrust, and that's where I want to be. So I really need all those things to be firing all together for the deck to be functional. But without that access there anymore, it's severely hindered. I'm not going to have to think about a new way of approaching that deck. A lot of decks use Beatrice as a way to fix their consistency issues or access their pieces that are kind of just not like designed that well. So That being gone does make some decks kind of invalidated, and it will separate even further the rogue from the meta decks. But I'm not trying to apologize for Beatrice here. Again, it had too many problems with it that it didn't need to exist, but some decks will pay the price, not just BA, for Beatrice being banned. And then lastly, there's one other deck I want to talk about, and it's again in reference to Fiends with Hits. It's Memento. Remember a few weeks ago, I talked about how Memento could be the next best Yu-Gi-Oh deck, and if I'd known that Lacrima was getting hit and the Banlist would turn out this way, I wouldn't have said that. I expected a full-on slaughter for Snake Eyes, a bit more than a tap on the wrist to Yubel, and I thought that Memento would just be relatively unhit, not needing Appaloosa or Beatrice because Aerial Eater exists. But what you did need, however, was Lacrima. Randomly, you need a Lacrima. If you go back and watch the video, and the one card Engraver combo I showed you guys, you use Lacrima to set up the Light Fiends necessary for your Engraver play. Now the Fiends with the cards, while not being dead in that deck, are just definitely worse. Engraver no longer gets you the same access to your engine that you had before. And for a deck that was already a tier behind Snake Eye and Yubel, it going down the same amount of power as Snake Eye is not ideal. But the deck is still okay, right? Like, you still have the same powerful engine. You have mostly the same starters, as well as you can still fill in a suite of non-engine, but it is a clear loser here because it seemed like a deck well poised to be in a successful Spawnex format. It's no longer looking like a prime candidate anymore. Now, if you are a Memento player, do not get too scared just yet, because Rage of the Abyss will introduce some new Goblin support cards that randomly help Memento, because again, the key card in Memento Goblin is a Goblin. It's a Fiend and a Goblin, so it does whatever we want. Accessible via Fiendsmiths and Aerial Leader, accessible via Goblin support cards. So we'll have fun with that when it comes out in the near future in Rage of the Abyss. But that's all for now, guys. Let me know what your thoughts are. If you feel like I overstated or understated any of the changes within the categories, or if there are anything else I'm missing. That's all for now. I'll see you guys all next time. Peace.